105, no, 104, 104. Ah! As if you're not going to put that in now. Hello and welcome to episode 104 of Retropower Uncut. I'm going to start with the Land Cruiser. Not massive movement on this week. I know Alistair's been on with the CAD work now for the inlet manifold after he did his scanning work last week with his very envy-inducing Faro laser scanner. And Adam is on currently with the screen wash plumbing. So we've got these two tanks that we've had made to sit in these saddles here. This one's a radiator overflow tank. This side there'll be a screen wash tank. That feeds down to a pump that's mounted just down here, so he's made the bracket for that, and then he's just trying to find a really neat routing for the hose now. So it's going to essentially go along inside the chassis leg, up on the back of this flange here, so it's pretty much hidden. And then it will come around onto the back of this flange here, along the back of there, and then it will just loop round on that section there. So pretty happy that's going to look really tidy. We had the mirrors on, they're actually off again at the minute, just to make a small tweak, but a while ago we machined from aluminium a sort of revised mirror to replace the plastic mirrors that originally came on these. We've used the original arms, just disassembled those, blasted them, had them black Xylan coated, and then the mirrors themselves are black anodized aluminium. And then we've done this system where the two kind of blocks on the back of the mirror bolt together with little nylon inserts with a sort of half ball socket machined into them, so you can basically adjust how tightly they clamp on the balls on the end of the arms to sort of decide how easy they are to move. And then once you're happy with that, you bolt them up from the inside and then the glasses go in. So we had them temporarily on. We want to just machine the little nylon inserts down slightly more, because I think visually it'll look better if the two aluminium blocks are closer and the gap between them is a bit tighter. So that's where we're at with that. They had the bumper on this week as well, which looked awesome, but again it's been removed. It was just to trial fit all of the fasteners, make sure we're happy with the fit of all those, I think they're called carriage bolts, aren't they, with the dome head and the little square insert that goes into the bumper, so they could go away for coating. So that's kind of all falling into place. We're about to do the oil plumbing on this. So we've got a remote filter head on the chassis leg down there. When we did the engine build, we basically replaced the original filter housing with a takeoff with a 2 AN10 male spigots on it, and then we've got a air to oil cooler at the front here, and then the radiator itself, actually, which is being done at the moment, we're doing a water to oil cooler in the bottom tank of the radiator to do the transmission cooling. But yeah, we're about to do the oil plumbing on this, and then Adam's finished the coolant plumbing. So we were waiting on some fittings to go on the bulkhead, the vintage air type fittings to do the coolant plumbing. So that one's on there now with that 180. We've just got to clip that on. We'd finished the ones on the inside, which was really what we were waiting for, which is again awkward because of the packaging of everything behind the dash on this is tight, but we got there in the end with a routing for all the refrigerants and hot water lines that is tight and out of the way and not visible. So all good, all moving in the right direction, and I've now got notification that the leather will be with me fairly soon. Obviously, you've probably noticed we've not made any progress on the interior, and that's because we were having this woven leather made up where they basically strip a hide into 7mm strips and weave it all and laminate it onto a backing, and it's done by an Italian tannery, and they closed down for the month of August, as a lot of businesses in Italy do. So I think the end of this month we're getting that through, so I'm excited to get that, and then we can get the seats in progress. And speaking of seats, on the Mustang, the main area of progress has been getting the subframes designed and made for the Recaro seats we're putting in. So we've got some Recaro LXs. They are, in this instance, from a Capri 2.8 donor car. And we've made some pretty heavy duty subframes. It's one of those jobs that took a lot of thinking to make an elegant solution of it. There's a big box in the floor, where the original seat mounted, but the front of the runners in the position we felt comfortable having the seat in ends up right in the middle of the box, and the box is really flexible. And if we literally just put some anchor points in there, you could kind of flex the box up and down in the middle, and the whole seat subframe rocked slightly, not hugely, but enough that it was not very confidence inspiring. So we've made a big subframe plate in, I think it's 4mm steel, with an upturned edge each side to give it stiffness, and then we've extended that right forward to the original seat mounting point. It picks up the original seat mounting rear point as well, so it's got the original 4 mounting points bolted through it, and then it extends back to the floor, kind of because our seat's sitting further back, and bolts into a floor with some anchor plates underneath to reinforce that, and then the seat bolts down to that with some welded bosses. So it's just a really stiff, you know, you sit in that seat now and there's no flex at all, so really happy with that. It's a great driving position as well. They're an awkward car, this, because the steering wheel sits very low and the steering wheel bottom to floor height is very, very close compared to most cars. So getting a seat low enough that your legs can get under the steering wheel comfortably is quite tricky. But I think we've got a really nice position in there now, nice supportive seat, quite laid back, good support under the sort of bottom of your legs. So yeah, ready to make the other one of those, get those painted and in the meantime the seats can go off to be upholstered. We'll have a little squeeze through this way. Manta. Bobby was tying up the remainder of the brake plumbing. We were just waiting for some adapters onto the line lock that's going into it, but that's now finished, so that's completely in situ now, ready to be filled and bled if we wanted to. And then he moved on to the clutch. So we're doing the clutch plumbing, needed a reservoir in there, and we wanted something that looked in keeping. Now there's a big rectangular screen wash plastic bottle which we're retaining on this as per original. So we've used like a rectangular Wilwood plastic reservoir which kind of mimics that, and then mounted it off the side of the bracket for the original screen wash tank. And then Bobby's done quite a clever little bracket for it that's got a machine spigot with an O-ring on it, so the reservoir actually pushes over that O-ring and seals on. And then that goes immediately through a grommet in the top of the sort of footwell area, and then the union from that to the master cylinder is underneath on the inside of the car. So there is no visible pipe transferring from the reservoir in the engine bay to inside. It literally sits straight through. So that was a really neat solution. And then on the actual feed from the master cylinder to the slave cylinder, we were trying to come up with a neat way of doing that. And there's a hole in the bulkhead where the clutch cable used to go through. So we've actually machined a little insert in there that presses in and then has a 90-degree bulkhead fitting, so that all looks sort of like it grew there, if you like. So that's the clutch plumbing done, brake plumbing done. We'd already done the coolant plumbing, oil plumbing's done, we're just working on the breather plumbing now, so we're just getting a nice position for the breather tank. And where the breathers come out of the rocker covers, they point straight up, and I don't really want that loop of pipe that's going to result. It's going to look a bit untidy, so we're going to make some little 90-degree adapters that press over those spigots, so the pipes go straight back down the rocker covers, which will be a nice neat routing for those. So that's really then the last mechanical bit on this. And we're going to start getting onto wiring next, and then the rest of the build-up. And probably I'm most excited about getting the wheels, which are in progress at the minute. So they're a 3-piece split rim version of the original 5-spoke Ronals with a polished lip. We're going to do painted centres to match the body, so they're going to look pretty awesome, I think. So that's where we're at with that. Moving on to Project Norman, the E-Type. Jim's been on with this, so I think he started it last week, the revised pedal box / reservoir. I think he printed just the base part of it last time to check the footprint fitted the bulkhead okay. So he's carried on now, finished the design for the top, done a 3D print of that. I really like this design. It's basically done a rib design. It sort of tapers across at the same angle as this chassis section and the same angle as the side of the reservoir. But by keeping this side square and tapering the ribs across, it then gives us a sort of flat, unribbed area to put the cap in, which I think works really well. So that's that, and then inside here there's also a vertical float level sensor which mounts through the base of the tank. And the beauty of that is that the wiring to it actually goes up from inside the car, so the transition of the wiring for the brake fluid reservoir level sender from being in the engine bay to inside is actually integrated into that piece. So I think that's a really neat solution, and if we're all happy with that, then I think we'll probably do a mirror image of it that side, depending on there being space, as a screen wash reservoir. Another thing also, just today I think it was, these UJs turned up finally for the steering column. So Kylie Clinton have done these for us. This one has got this odd sort of shaped fitting which goes straight onto the Mondeo / Ford Focus steering rack, and then has like a 3/4 DD, which is basically a 3/4 inch shaft with 2 flats machined onto it. So then our downlink shaft will be a 3/4 inch DD shaft. The other UJ has got the same detail, and then actually we sent them a BMW joint because we've got the BMW steering column, and they didn't have a splining tool for that spline, and then they've just essentially made a hybrid of the two joints. So that'll be nice and simple now, straight onto the BMW column, dead straightforward 3/4 DD shaft all the way down, one more UJ straight onto the rack, and that's what we've been waiting for, to set the position of that rack so we can get on with the steering rack mounts. So that's where we're at on that. Morris, few avenues of progress on this. I've been wanting to get some progress on the interior done, start getting things together on that. So I wanted to get the headlining in because that dictates then being able to fit the rear window. And we wanted to get some of the other wiring components in, so the wiring pulled up and through the pillar for the interior mirror, which I'll go into in a minute, and the interior light. We made a little pod up there that mounts the interior light to replace the way it used to be mounted in a wooden panel that sort of sit over the front of the headlining. Just thought that looked a little bit neater. And we've offered up the lower dash again just to work out the positioning of where all the wiring comes, because it is insanely tight behind there. So we've got the vents through, as I mentioned last week. Those go in nicely, the stereo head unit fits in there fine. You've got to really pick the routing for the wiring carefully under the console, and then there's various gadgets that have got to be mounted, which there's a nice space for in the sort of in front of the gear shifter, under the console, under the sort of cordless charging unit that you put your phone in on the console. There's a little bit of a void, so we've got the unit that converts the signal from the speed signal from the gearbox to the speedo. We've got the central locking controller. There's also a gadget that we're using for the fuel gauge calibration, which also can generate a warning light for that as well. So a few little control boxes to go in there. But yeah, it's all looking good. I'm actually excited to get that all together. We've just got to make a panel that closes in the area where the gear stick goes, and then all of that can go in. Tunnel carpet can go in, centre console can go in. Other avenue of progress was the air filter backplate. We made that before. We've now put in spigots for the breathers on that and for the air temp sensor, and it's been painted, and it was painted along with the power steering pump, which was previously fitted, but I had this little niggling feeling at the back of my mind, and we decided to address it, where the reservoir feed to the pump is just a pressed in spigot, and it is originally, but I just wasn't totally happy with it, because although it's extremely unlikely to come out because it's not even under any pressure, if it did, it's immediately going to drain the entire power steering system straight onto the exhaust manifold, which would almost certainly be an instant fire. So we decided to take that back apart, clean it up, and actually braze a fitting onto there so it can't come off. And so then we repainted it, and that's ready to be refitted now. And just a little bit more peace of mind on that one. If you can think things where there is potential to go wrong, it's usually best to make sure those things can't go wrong. And we finished the alternator belt train rearrangement, and we were just starting that last week with that new pulley, which kind of redirects the belt run slightly, which then means the swing on the alternator can be used to tension the belt again. It's actually reversed in that you swing the alternator in to tension the belt, whereas on the rear wheel drive normal belt train setup for these, you'd swing it outwards, but it works really well. So once the power steering pump's on, that belt can go on for the last time. And then the other thing, which sort of related to the headlining, was testing the camera and mirror system. So we're using a Gentex full display mirror, I think they call them. Now Gentex supply a lot of OEM manufacturers with their kind of mirror systems, and it's basically a normal mirror. And it can't even be used as a standard mirror, but it's got a screen built into it, so you can flick it to mirror mode or screen mode, which then has a camera in the back window. And it's just nice because it means it's an uninterrupted view. You normally, when you look in your rearview mirror, you kind of see a lot of the interior of the car, maybe the headrests, you know, or the inside of the rear of here, and just a little window where you see out the back. Whereas if you use a camera in the back window on the screen, then it's a completely uninterrupted view behind you. And it's also LCD dimming, so it's light sensing, like the sort of auto dimming normal mirrors. It also dims the LCD down according to whether there's headlights behind you, etc. And as I say, you can flip it onto normal mirror mode. You can also zoom in and out and tweak brightness manually on the buttons on there. And then there's an additional mode which you can put a second camera feed into it, which when you put an electrical feed to one of the connections on there, which would be off the reverse light circuit, it switches on this additional display, which is then connected to the camera we've got in this number plate mount, which we showed ages ago, where we machined a little piece there which holds the number plate light, and then there's a little housing for a little camera in there. So when you shift into reverse, a little additional display comes up right down there, because from the main rear view sort of mirror display to see a long way back, you then don't see right down here, so that when you reverse camera, it doesn't see right back there, but it shows really, really close up, so you can see a curb you're reversing up to, etc. So I was just connecting those cameras up yesterday, firing up the mirror electrically just on the floor rather than it being fitted, to make sure it all worked right, made sure the view from the cameras was good, and I'm happy with all of that. So the wiring for all that lot's going to go in now as well, and then we can finish off the front of the headlining. So that's good, and actually the same camera mirror system is being used on the Stratos, which we're kind of in that final push towards getting it ready for IVA. And one of the things is the field of view tests. You've got to be able to see a certain pattern of markers behind you in the test, which with just the wing mirrors, it's going to be borderline, and there's obviously not a lot of rear visibility out of the back window. So we're tackling that by using the same rear view camera system. Camera's going to be in the rear panel of the car. So that'll give us a ridiculously good field of view, so there'll be no problem with that. John's been on with a few other little niggly jobs on that. The main one that's upcoming now is the exhaust system, which is realistically going to be our biggest challenge on IVA because it's very loud. So we're doing a sort of IVA compliant exhaust, which will have catalysts in it, so we can get the emissions compliant, and a lot of additional baffling and silencing to try and get the noise level down, which may or may not be removed after the IVA test. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Nat to show you what's going on in the metal workshop, and I'll see you next week.
Ooh. Right, well, thank you, Cal, and here we are in the fabrication shop for another episode of Uncut from the dark side. We're going to start with the second MK1 Escort. I can't actually remember what we've decided to call this one. I know there's been a conversation, but I'm not going to try and say it because I'll probably get it wrong. So the second MK1 Escort project, which will be running more or less in parallel with the first. Obviously, there's a reason we haven't done them completely in parallel, in that Mr. Select Jig here, we only have one of available really to do this. We've only got one fixture set. Yes, we could make a second fixture set. That would be a load of work unnecessarily. So we've got to the stage, as you'll know from last week, where we could get the first one off the jig. So second one has come on the jig. We're not going to be actively pushing the metalwork too hard on this at the moment, because we're going to try and push the first one through to metalwork complete first. But there are some jobs we can do in parallel and pick up and put down, and some things we want to get a little bit ahead on. While we've got the chance. So we did a little bit of an analysis of the panels that we needed. We'd already done an order of panels for this car, but then we revised that and had to add a few extras. Like, we're going for complete inner wings now. Due to accident damage and various other bits, we're just going to change the complete inner wings for the Evo type ones, just because it'll save time. It's easier to pay the extra money for the inner wings and fit complete ones than it is to mess about repairing these. So we're going to do that. We're going to change the heater bulge, because we do a modification inside to make it a removable back in the heater bulge. So this morning Rich has removed the heater bulge and put some anti-corrosion epoxy on that. Obviously that's going to be cut out and altered and welded and whatever, but we wanted to get it cleaned up, the rust removed, and some epoxy on it. Obviously we've got to weld up some little holes from some spot weld removal there. And then on the rear, you may recall from previous episodes, this car had an aftermarket rear scuttle fitted. I assume it had had a rear screen cut out badly at some point in its past. And there was some corrosion around the rear window aperture which had chewed through the scuttle, so it had had a replacement scuttle, which was an Express Panels type one, where they don't, for some reason, they don't cut out the grills in the rear scuttle, which we didn't want, and we wanted to make sure that there was nothing lurking under that. So Rich has also removed that rear scuttle, cleaned that up inside, put some epoxy in there. We've got a bit of rectification work to do where somebody had got a bit slapdash with a grinder when they repaired that panel in the past, so we need to tidy that up a bit before we put the new one on. So we've got a new scuttle to go on there, new heater bulge to go on here after we've done the modification to the back plate to make that removable from the inside. Inner wings to go on, front panel to go on. As it is the inner front panel, we are changing tack, and I'm completely fabricating that now. There are so many parts of the original inner front panel that we've got to change, and so many bits that we weren't really very convinced by the shape of or by the look of, that we're actually fabricating a new scuttle panel and inner front panel from scratch, so it's fairly irrelevant, the replacement of that. And then there are a few other bits, but really, as I think this was probably mentioned last week, but really, as shells go, it's just incredibly good. Doesn't need sills, doesn't need floors, they've never been welded, they don't need any welding. I will probably cut the rear part of the sill open at the very bottom under the quarter panel just to clean it out and check it all inside. But as far as we can tell, it's pretty much perfect in that respect. So we're certainly a large step forward compared to the other car. Massively reduced metalwork workload in terms of rot repair. No damage down the gutters either, so the roof doesn't need to come off, the gutters don't need to come off. They were pretty poorly fitted by Ford originally. They're not very symmetrical and they're a bit all over the place. I think these last of the line Mark 1s, we've noticed a few things putting it on the jig where I think the fixtures for production were getting sloppy, because we've noticed a lot of the alignment holes are just not very well aligned. I think everything was worn out and sloppy. This would have been one of the very last cars off the line at Halewood, and I have a sneaking suspicion that everything was worn out by the time these were being made, because the panel alignments compared to the earlier car, even though that's not an early car, but the panel alignments on this are pretty poor compared to that, and it's obvious it's factory alignments, not anything that's happened afterwards, because the vast bulk, other than a bit around the front, is untouched. So yeah, it's a good one. Keep an eye on, but yes, we've a much reduced metalwork workload compared to the other one. On that subject, Project 1, Mark 1 Escort, we'll wander around to that now. Tom's been really lashing on with progress on this now. So we'll start at the end that he's working on. At the back, he has finished the rear floor pan. I can't remember where he was at last week on that one. He'd made the sections but not put them in, isn't that right, Jane? Yeah, the rear triangular sections of the floor box, if you like, that's giving us exhaust clearance and clearance to the front of the rear subframe, and just giving us some space for everything under the car, so we've not got problems with exhaust rattles and things like that. He's finished making the tops for that. And he's got them all metal finished and welded in. He's then proceeded onto the rear bulkhead. He's made the centre section for the rear bulkhead, pressed some nice reinforcement pressings into that. Again, metal finished it, crimped it up where it got slack in from doing the pressings, tidied all that up, stitch welded that in really nicely. Then he's moved on to the rear floor, got the rear floor sections, the first part in, is now on the second part there, and then he's going to do the boot floor next. So that's going to progress pretty quickly. He's got to make a couple of little bulkhead sections to box off the ends of the floor to the top of the chassis rails each side. So we get those bits done. That's really progressing well. Once that's done, then it's onto the parcel shelf. That's 3-piece, 2 side sections with returns on, then a centre section that drops in. We're making those pieces up and getting all that in. And that's a good chunk of the sheet metal there. Realistically then we're going to be on to getting the rear half cage done, basically a hoop and 2 diagonals, getting that in, which I'll need to get on with, and then some more sheet work. Once we've got the cage legs in, some more sheet work to finish off what was the original seat base mount, the little rear lower bulkhead section where the seat base originally went. Obviously that's going in a slightly different position now, and we've got to finish off that current cover box that covers the rear suspension area. That's going to be the front face of that's going to be extended outwards with some pressings in to go out to the bottom of the cage legs and tie them into the B pillar, well, the lower quarter B pillar area as well. So we've got that to do. In the meantime, I've been working on the front of the car and going backwards and forwards a little bit. We concluded after a bit of toing and froing that we really didn't like the aftermarket scuttle panel, which is part of the inner front panel. And to be honest, when you look at the original Ford one, it's not that much better really. It's a bit indistinct, it's a bit all over the place, and it was a pressing that did a job, but it did a couple of bits of its job quite crudely. One part of its job was the main bonnet catch, and it has a spring, a little sort of finger spring with a catch striker that goes through a hole which is welded into the front panel, which is spot welded into the front panel, and then there's spring which engages through a slot in that sort of tube, if you like, to engage the bonnet catch. And the problem with all of that is that all of the moving parts are rubbing on a painted part of the car. There's no wearing surface there, if you like. It's all direct on painted stuff, so it relies on grease to prevent it rusting. It's not a particularly nice design. Brilliant design from a cost effectiveness point of view by Ford, as the entire car was originally. I think I've touched, going on a slight tangent, which I'm trying not to do today. I've promised Jamie I'm not going to go on too many tangents, but a slight tangent. I mentioned in a previous episode some time ago, and caught some criticism in comments, I noticed, for saying that it was such an incredibly well-designed car originally. I'll reiterate, Mark 1 Escorts were an incredibly well-designed car originally. They weren't sophisticated. No, they didn't need to be. They were incredibly well designed to make Ford money and meet the expectations of the car buying public. And that's exactly what they did. In fact, they raised the expectations of the car buying public because they were fairly low before these came out. And actually, for doing the job of a car with an absolute minimum number of parts, whilst maximising the profits of the manufacturer and enabling people to get around in a pretty cheap vehicle, they were brilliant, and they still are. So that's the angle I was coming at there. But we came to the conclusion the original scuttle panel wasn't overly brilliant, did its job very well, but doesn't look too pretty. And that with the amount of changes we've got to make to the front, I've actually decided to just remake the inner front panel and the scuttle panel from scratch. And so that these areas where the bonnet catch engages and where the bonnet safety catch engage don't corrode, because as I say, they normally engage with just a painted part. What we're going to do is actually make some separate little billet pieces that drop in and do some pressed recesses in the new panel, and then have some probably machined in stainless and then maybe Xylan coated, or maybe not, we don't know yet, but probably machined in stainless, drop in billet sections for the bonnet striker and for the safety catch, so that we don't get corrosion, so that the engagement points for the catches are all bolt-on parts that also have adjustment, which will be helpful, but also are non-corroding. So it removes that problem entirely, and it'll just look a lot neater as well. So watch this space on that. At the minute I've kind of got the scuttle panel blanked out and the rough shape put into it, but I've got to work out how to do the recesses and where everything's got to go, and we've got a bit of complication to deal with there in terms of space between the bonnet catch and the radiator and such fun as that. So you'll see that develop. But yeah, lots to see next week again on that as Tom progresses with that stuff, and I'll hopefully get on with a bit more at the front. Moving on then onto Churchill Jag. We have an engine in. Was that in last week? This is where I have the downside of me not being here last week, because I don't actually know where we were last week, and I haven't watched the video from last week because I literally haven't had a chance to. I've literally not been in the house for long enough to watch it.
Engine in this week.
Engine in this week, right? Okay, thank you, Jamie. And yeah, the new normally aspirated engine. I don't know if we've mentioned that before now, but we have changed tack and we're actually going normally aspirated rather than supercharged on this car now. The reason for that is packaging. We could not package the supercharged engine and all of the cooling stuff to a standard that we were happy with in this body shell without ruining the appearance of the body shell, and we decided that the primary functions of the car were not pure acceleration and were not pure performance. A lot of the functions of the car were cruising, it looking really cool, and having the sort of the heart of a Jaguar on this one. Unusually for us, we kind of wanted to keep it all Jag on this particular car, just because we did. So we're going AJ16, 4 litre, straight 6, non-supercharged, normally aspirated, but we're going to do some work on the engine. It'll have throttle bodies on it, obviously tubular manifold, various bits of headwork, cams, etc., just to get some more performance from it, just to urge it along a little quicker than the standard engine would. But yeah, Stu's now got that pretty much mounted up. He's done the mountings are all solidly tacked in place. They're not fully welded, but they're solidly tacked in place onto the chassis rails. He's going to fully weld them once he can get at it, either on the rotisserie or certainly with the engine out, because at the minute it's almost impossible for him to get at those mounts to fully weld them. They're just pretty much inaccessible because they're tucked into a tiny gap. They're actually really neat because they tuck in really tightly between the original engine mountings on the Jag engine as it came from the X300 and the actual Mark II Jag original chassis rails. But it's just that sneaking into that space with a welding torch is quite tricky. So he's got them tack welded in pretty well at the moment. Other than that, he's now moved on from making sure that we've got room for everything at the front, which we now have. He's now moved on to getting the gearbox mounting in, which we're using X300 gearbox mount, but he's now modifying the floor pan and the main crossbeam in the car, the original seat mount main crossbeam, so that it can carry the gearbox cross member, and that needs a little bit of rework. We've got to extend the tunnel a bit, grow the tunnel a bit to make a bit more room around the transmission, because the tunnels in these Mark IIs were very, very small. You have to enlarge them for pretty much anything, and in this particularly with the 4L80, it's a GM 4L80 transmission. We're actually using the transmission from the supercharged donor, We've got a couple of those around at the minute because we've got another one on the V12 in the E-Type next door. So we're using the 4L80. We know it's more than comfortable with the power, whereas the problem is that the other transmission option that was bolt on for the AJ16 was the ZF 4HP 22. That's a little bit more on its limits with the power. Yes, we could use a 4HP 24 and there's workarounds for that, but we're just sticking with the 4L80, and the parts backup's brilliant. All the internals are just the standard parts from GM, so it can be rebuilt very easily, and there's a standalone controller very easily available. I know there is also for the ZF gearbox, but there's a standalone controller which we've got for the 4L80s, the CompuShift controller. So it all makes sense to carry on using that transmission. It's just, we know it's bomb proof and there's no problems going forward, and it's versatile, so we're sticking with that. So Stu's narrowing we're taking the centre section out of that cross box, fabricating a new one that's a bit wider to clear the transmission, fabricating the nut plates into the floor to bolt the transmission mount to, and then going to refabricate the floor in that area and then make the transmission tunnel. So that's what he's on with at the moment, and he's also then been just verifying that all the dash tube work that he'd been working on previously does still clear. Now he's actually got the engine exactly in its final position, which it does. It's all particularly tight at the back end where the bulkhead is, trying to make space around there and still have room for the HVAC and everything else that's got to go in, and the pedal box and seats and comfortable driving positions, yada 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 yada. You know, sat nav screen in the dash, everything else, everything clashes for space. There's not a lot of space in old cars, so he's been working on making sure there's room for all that. Pretty much there with all that now, so yeah, watch this space. I keep saying that, don't I? I like saying that, but yeah, there'll be a lot of transmission, gearbox mounting and transmission tunnel development over the next week on that. So yeah, got that to look forward to. I think then we'll have a quick nosy in the body shop area where Steve and Gaz are busily beavering away. Gaz is currently doing a little bit more work on the Jensen CV8 bonnet. The rest of the Jensen's obviously over at KS Composites now for the main body mould to be taken and then the actual body to be produced. In the meantime, they've been working on the E-Type, continuing with that. We're now at the position where really progress on the E-Type body shell now depends on the bonnet. And for reasons previously addressed, and I don't know how much Carl went into it last week again, the bonnet is an enormously convoluted job to paint. So we're part way through those convolutions at the moment, and whilst we're waiting for some paint to go off on those convolutions, Gaz is doing a little bit of work that was left over on the CV8 bonnet, which is that the front of the air scoop, if you like, on the bonnet had a chrome finisher on it that was damaged, and the threads were broken, and they were BA threads, and basically we replaced those with some nice metric threads, sprayed some new little bolts onto there, reshaped the chrome a bit and got that a bit straighter, and then he's then blocking that part of the bonnet so that it meets the chrome more nicely for when the mould gets taken off that. We don't want the mould to be taken, it'd be completely wrong around the chrome trim, so he's just working on that at the minute. In the meantime, Steve's tidying up the first one of the MK1 Escort carbon fibre bonnets. The sealer on the back needs some tidying, it's not really neat enough, so we're just doing a bit of tidying up on that. And he's done the initial blocking on the outside, just looking for, finding any big low spots and high spots and whatever, and just getting the outer shape somewhere near. Not doing the final fit to the car at the minute, but just making sure we haven't got anything that's really going to catch us out there. Is it looking somewhere? Yeah, we've not found anything that's going to really upset us, so that's good. It's basically just getting it so that we're in a position where we can put it on the car and actually work on making it fit the car and all the fiddling around required there, rather than also worrying about whether it's actually going to block out and be a good shape on the outside. So Steve's working away on that, but as you can see at the moment he's just trimming back the sealer, and then we'll be re-sealing all the sealer on the back just to get it really super neat and tidy. So that's where we're at on that. And I think we'll have a little wander through to the paint booth. In the meantime, actually, I'm walking past here. You can see a few of the E-Type bits there. Walking past, we're doing a bit of maintenance on Chevette rally car, Alistair's Chevette rally car. He'd, in an off earlier in the year, he hit the steering rack and bent the steering rack mounts on the cross member, and they'd been left as is for a while. But it was very hard to put, the rack was in pretty much the right place, but it was very hard to get the bolts in because one of the mounts was twisted. So we've made some new mounts, reinforced them quite heavily, and also just made them replaceable threads, so that if they go again, we can actually slide they're a captive nut plate, and they actually slide out, so they're removable from the cross member. So if he has an unfortunate incident with the rack threads on an event, as it was, if you lose a rack thread on a reinforced Chevette steering rack mount, you can't actually change the bolts or nuts, and you could be out of an event for it, whereas now you can undo a nut, slide the nut plate out, slide a new nut plate in, do another little bolt up, and then the rack will bolt back on. So just a bit of a little modification there to make the car a bit more maintainable. In the meantime, in here, I'm breathing 2K fumes in the minute. It's not too long ago finished, but dry enough that I can stand in here. The inner panel work that needed a painted finish on the E-Type has now been done to that painted finish. So the main section of the inside of the bonnet and all the edges where the flanges are going to be bolted together have been given the paint finish. So then the next round of events will be bolting all this together on those painted sections, and then doing all the re-prep on the outside, doing the brazing on the front seams where they've got to be brazed, and then doing some touch-up on the wraps underneath, and then doing the final prepping with the bonnet on the car with the inside all masked up to protect it, and then doing the paint on the outside along with the paint on the rest of the car. So that's a quick synopsis of where we're at on a quite convoluted story of painting the front end of an E-Type. As I say, if trying to do it in one piece, I have no idea how anybody ever prevents one of these rotting away, because if you try and do it as paint it as an assembled part, then it's going to have no longevity at all. So the only way we can see of doing it is to do it in sections, then assemble it, and then have to retouch up and deal with a few little areas afterwards where the paint might be damaged in putting it all together. So I think that pretty much sums up where we're at this week. So yeah, see you again in a week's time.